The trail was quiet, save for the crunch of my boots against the packed dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I had chosen this hike for its solitude, miles of untamed wilderness, far from the noise of everyday life. It was just me, the trees, and the endless stretch of path ahead. As I rounded a bend, I noticed someone sitting by the side of the trail, a backpacker. His gear was scattered haphazardly around him, a crumpled tent, a water bottle tipped on its side. He looked up as I approached, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You okay?" He nodded quickly, but didn't speak right away. After a long pause, he gestured toward his water bottle. "Out of water," he said hoarsely. I hesitated for a moment before reaching into my pack and handing him a spare bottle. He drank greedily, spilling some down his chin, before finally looking at me properly. "Thanks," he muttered. "No problem," I replied, glancing at his gear. "You lost?" His lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Something like that," he said. "Mind if I walk with you? Just for a bit?" I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but it felt cruel to say no. "Sure," I said reluctantly. He grabbed his pack and fell into step beside me. At first, the backpacker was quiet, walking a few paces behind me. But as we continued, his behavior became stranger. He mumbled to himself, words too low for me to catch, and his head constantly turned as if he were scanning the forest for something or someone. "You ever see anything weird out here?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I glanced over my shoulder. "Weird how?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stopped walking and stared into the trees. "I thought I saw something earlier," he said finally. "Something big." "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to keep my tone light. He shook his head. "Wasn't a deer. It was taller, bigger. It moved fast." Unease crept over me, but I forced myself to shrug. "It's a big forest. Could have been anything." The backpacker didn't respond. He just kept walking, his pace quickening as if trying to stay ahead of something I couldn't see. We stopped for a break at a clearing, and I set my pack down, grateful for the chance to rest. The backpacker stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the ground. As I rummaged through my pack, I pulled out a cord tied to a piece of obsidian, a gift from a friend who had a fascination with crystals and superstitions. It was supposed to be some kind of charm, though I'd never paid much attention to its supposed meaning. The moment the backpacker saw it, his face went pale. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice trembling. A friend gave it to me," I said, startled. "Why?" He stepped back, shaking his head violently. "I've seen that before. It's bad. You shouldn't have it." "What are you talking about?" I asked, but before I could get an answer, he turned and bolted into the trees. "Wait," I called after him, but he didn't stop. In seconds, he was gone, the sound of his frantic footsteps fading into the distance. I stood there, stunned, clutching the obsidian cord in my hand. His reaction had been so visceral, so sudden, that I couldn't shake the chill it left behind. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. I pressed on, trying to shake off the unease the backpacker's words had left behind. He'd seemed unhinged, paranoid, probably just dehydrated or exhausted. That had to be it. But as the light faded, the forest seemed to change. The trees loomed taller, their branches stretching like claws against the twilight sky. The usual sounds of the woods, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, grew quieter, replaced by an eerie stillness. And then I heard it. A low, guttural howl echoed through the trees, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the mournful cry of a wolf or the sharp yip of a coyote. This was deeper, more resonant, and it sent a wave of cold fear washing over me. I froze, straining to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It came again, louder this time, closer. A movement caught my eye. On the trail ahead, a tall, robust figure crossed between the trees. It was too far away to make out clearly, but its sheer size and strange, lumbering gait were unmistakable. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my breath caught in my throat. The figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the fading echo of its footsteps. Panic surged through me. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to meet it. I turned back the way I came, my pace quickening as the fading light made the trail harder to navigate. I practically jogged down the trail, my heart pounding with each step. The faint echoes of the howl still rang in my ears, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me flinch. The forest, which had felt so tranquil earlier, now seemed hostile, its darkened trees pressing in from all sides. I couldn't shake the image of the figure I'd seen, its unnatural height, the slow, deliberate way it had moved. It wasn't just its size that unnerved me. It was the way it seemed to command the space around it, as though the forest bent to its will. Part of me wanted to turn back toward the clearing, to see if I could find the backpacker. Maybe he'd been onto something, and we could face this together. But the memory of his panic, the raw terror in his eyes, stopped me. If he couldn't handle whatever this was, how could I? Another howl broke through the silence, closer now, deeper and more resonant. My chest tightened, and my instincts screamed at me to run. There was no way I was finishing this hike, no matter how much I hated the idea of quitting. Whatever lay ahead wasn't worth the risk. The trail seemed endless as I retraced my steps, each turn looking eerily similar to the last. The faint glow of the setting sun barely pierced the canopy, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to shift as I passed. My pace quickened, every muscle in my body taut with adrenaline. My breaths came shallow and fast, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. I kept expecting to see the figure emerge from the trees, its massive form blocking my escape. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop, the backpacker's gear, discarded on the side of the trail. His pack was tipped over, its contents spilled out haphazardly. A flashlight lay shattered nearby, its broken glass glinting in the faint light. There was no sign of him. I crouched down, scanning the area for any clues. The ground around the gear was scuffed, as though there had been a struggle. Small branches were snapped, and the leaves bore deep, erratic indentations like someone, or something, had thrashed through them. I called out his name, my voice trembling, but the forest swallowed the sound. The thought of lingering crossed my mind for a fleeting moment, but the faint howl that followed shattered any resolve I had. I needed to get out of there. When I finally saw the trailhead in the distance, relief surged through me, followed closely by a wave of exhaustion. The safety of my car felt like a beacon, the only thing anchoring me to sanity after what I'd just experienced. I practically ran the last stretch, the sound of my boots against the dirt drowned out by my pounding heartbeat. The air felt lighter as I stepped onto the gravel parking lot, but my legs didn't stop moving until I reached the car. Fumbling with my keys, I unlocked the door and slid inside, locking it immediately behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, my breath ragged and uneven. What had I seen? The figure's size, the haunting howls, the backpacker's terror. It all churned in my mind, refusing to settle into a rational explanation. When I finally got home, I dropped my gear by the door and sank into a chair, the weight of the day pressing down on me. The cord with the obsidian still hung around my neck, its cool surface oddly comforting. I pulled out my phone, determined to make sense of the backpacker's reaction. A quick search for obsidian folklore brought up countless results. Protection, spiritual cleansing, warding off negative energy. But one entry stood out, a reference to obsidian being used as a talisman against supernatural entities, particularly those said to haunt remote wildernesses. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as my exhaustion deepened. Could the obsidian have been what frightened the backpacker? Or had it been something else entirely, something tied to the figure I'd seen? The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I'd brought the cord for no other reason than it was a gift, a novelty. But now it felt like it had been the only thing standing between me and whatever lurked in those woods. The road stretched ahead of me, dark and empty, except for the faint lines that guided my way. It had been a long day, and I was looking forward to the silence of the drive, the hum of the engine, and the soft glow of the dashboard. The air was crisp, and the headlights illuminated patches of asphalt that vanished into the void as I moved forward. There was something comforting about the solitude, a brief reprieve from the chaos of the day. It wasn't until I glanced in my rearview mirror that I noticed the car. Its headlights appeared far behind me, a distant pair of glowing eyes that seemed harmless at first. I didn't think much of it. Night roads had their share of travelers, and there was no reason to assume anything unusual. As the minutes passed, the car drew closer, its headlights growing brighter in the mirror. It didn't take long for it to settle uncomfortably close behind me, its presence too close for the empty road we shared. I slowed down slightly, expecting it to pass, but it didn't. It mirrored my speed, staying close enough that I could feel the tension of its presence. A flicker of annoyance turned to unease. I tapped the brake lightly, not enough to stop, but enough to signal. Still, the car refused to pass. Its headlights remained steady, cutting through the darkness like a predator eyeing its prey. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel, forcing myself to stay calm. This was nothing, I told myself. Just some driver who wasn't paying attention. But every attempt I made to shake them off was met with the same result. They stayed close, almost deliberately close, as if they wanted me to know they were there. I slowed down again, this time more significantly. My car dipped to a crawl, the type of speed that begged for a passerby. The road ahead was clear, wide enough for them to overtake me with ease. But they didn't. Instead, they slowed too, maintaining the same unsettling distance. The road began to curve, winding through patches of forest that seemed darker than the open stretches I had been driving earlier. My unease grew with each turn, every twist and shadow making the world feel smaller. I started to wonder who was behind me and why they were there. The quiet of the night felt oppressive now. Every bump in the road, every rustle of the trees, seemed louder than it should have been. The car's headlights were relentless, their glow creeping into the edges of my vision no matter how I tried to ignore it. I needed to get away. The thought of this car following me for miles, matching every turn and pace, made my chest tighten. I remembered a shortcut, a road I'd taken once before, years ago. It wasn't well traveled, but it was enough to shave time off the journey. More importantly, it might give me a way to lose this follower. The turnoff was barely visible in the dark, marked by a small, rusted sign that I almost missed. I signaled and took the turn, my tires crunching against gravel before hitting the uneven pavement. The shortcut was narrower than I remembered, and the trees on either side seemed to loom closer than they should. For a brief moment, I thought I'd lost them. The road behind me was empty, and I allowed myself a shaky breath of relief. But then, just as I turned a sharp corner, their headlights reappeared. They had followed me. My pulse quickened as I realized they had no reason to be here, on this obscure road, unless they were following me deliberately. I pressed the gas pedal harder, pushing the car faster than I was comfortable with on the narrow, winding road. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I took each curve, my headlights catching fleeting glimpses of trees and the occasional road sign. But no matter how fast I went, the car behind me stayed close, its headlights unwavering. It happened suddenly. The road curved sharply, and I miscalculated. My tires skidded, the steering wheel slipping in my hands for a split second too long. I felt the jolt as my car veered off the pavement and hit something, a ditch perhaps, or a low embankment. The impact jarred me forward, the seatbelt digging into my chest as the car sputtered to a stop. For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence that pressed into your ears and made the world feel frozen. Then I saw the car behind me. It had stopped too, its headlights illuminating my rearview mirror with an almost blinding intensity. I waited, my breath shallow and uneven, watching the mirror as if it held the answers. The other car didn't move, it just sat there, its engine humming faintly in the stillness of the night. My own car was dead, refusing to start no matter how many times I turned the key, and still, they didn't move. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally as I sat there, my hands still gripping the wheel, staring into the brightness of their headlights in the mirror. They weren't moving. I couldn't see the driver through the glare, but I knew they were there, watching. I tried starting my car again, turning the key with trembling fingers. The engine groaned, sputtered, but refused to turn over. Each attempt felt more futile, the sound of the failing engine punctuating the oppressive silence. My heart pounded as I considered stepping out, but the thought of leaving the car felt like stepping into the jaws of something I couldn't name. The car behind me remained still. The hum of its engine was the only thing I could hear, low and constant. I couldn't shake the feeling that the driver was waiting for something. But what? My mind raced, cycling through possibilities, each one worse than the last. I glanced at my phone on the passenger seat, but there was no signal here. The shortcut had taken me too far from main roads and cell towers. I was alone, trapped between the immobility of my car and the silent, watching presence behind me. Every second felt like a challenge, daring me to act or succumb to fear. Just as I was about to gather the courage to step out, the car behind me did something I didn't expect. Its engine revved softly, and then the headlights shifted. The car backed up, turned slightly, and began reversing down the road. I watched in disbelief as it maneuvered away, its taillights shrinking into the darkness until they disappeared entirely. The absence of its presence was jarring, leaving me in the same oppressive silence, but now without an explanation for what had just happened. Relief and confusion mixed uneasily. Why had they followed me? Why had they stopped? And most unsettling of all, why had they left? I didn't feel safe. I felt like I had been part of a game I didn't understand, one that had ended for reasons I couldn't grasp. I turned the key again, almost mechanically. This time, the engine roared to life. The sound startled me, and for a second, I didn't move, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Then instinct took over, and I put the car in gear, driving away from the spot as quickly as I could. The road seemed longer now, stretching endlessly through the dark. My relief at getting the car started was fleeting, quickly replaced by a heightened awareness of every sound and movement. I couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see those headlights reappear at any moment. Each curve and stretch of the road felt unfamiliar, even though I knew I had driven this way before. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. My hands were slick against the steering wheel, and I found myself driving faster than I normally would, desperate to reach somewhere, anywhere, that felt safe. But safety felt like a foreign concept now. My mind replayed the events in a loop, trying to find meaning in the followers' actions. Their persistence in tailing me, their decision to stop and just watch, their sudden departure, it all felt deliberate, intentional. And that was what unsettled me the most, the feeling that I had been chosen for something I couldn't understand. When I finally reached home, I didn't feel the relief I had expected. The familiar sight of my driveway and the glow of the porch light did little to ease the tension coiled in my chest. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, sitting there for a moment longer than I needed to, staring into the empty street behind me. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air brushing against my skin. It felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound stand out. I locked the car and hurried inside, flipping on the lights as soon as I was through the door. I didn't look out the windows. I didn't check the street again. I didn't want to know if the car had come back, if it had been waiting for me to let my guard down. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table, the events of the night playing over and over in my head. The air at the storage unit auction was thick with the energy of expectation and competition. I hadn't planned to attend, but a sign advertising the event had caught my eye as I drove home from work. The idea of finding something valuable, or at least interesting, hidden among forgotten belongings was tempting. The atmosphere was a mix of casual curiosity and sharp, seasoned bidders who seemed to know what to look for. As the auctioneer shouted numbers and bids flew, I found myself bidding on a unit that most seemed to overlook. The door rolled up to reveal a dusty mess, broken furniture, a few cardboard boxes, and stacks of yellowed papers spilling out of a filing cabinet. It wasn't glamorous, but the price was low, and the mystery was appealing. By the end of the day, it was mine. Loading the contents into my car was a quick, unimpressive task. The furniture pieces were too damaged to bother with, and the boxes seemed to hold nothing but faded receipts and records. Most of the files were stuffed with papers covered in handwritten notes and columns of names, numbers, and addresses. At a glance, it looked like some sort of outdated ledger, but it didn't seem significant. I drove home that evening, feeling a mix of satisfaction and mild regret. The papers and records didn't seem to hold much value, but I convinced myself that something in the pile might be worth looking into later. For now, I stacked the boxes in a corner of my garage and forgot about them. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to sift through the papers. The task was tedious. Most of the documents were old invoices, debt records, and notes scrawled in uneven handwriting. Some names had been circled, others crossed out, and the red ink annotation stood out starkly against the faded text. I couldn't make sense of the pattern. Were these collections? Loan records? The deeper I dug, the more unsettling it felt. The names and addresses were specific, detailed, and extensive. Something about the meticulous organization made it seem like this was more than just discarded paperwork. Still, I wasn't interested in digging too deeply. Whatever this was, it wasn't my business. I left the papers where they were, telling myself I'd figure out what to do with them later. As the days passed, I found myself oddly reluctant to move them. They were just papers, but they seemed to carry an invisible weight. It started small. The first night, I noticed the trash bin in the yard tipped over, its contents scattered across the lawn. I grumbled and cleaned it up, assuming it was raccoons. The following night, I woke up to the faint sound of footsteps outside my bedroom window. I froze, listening intently, but the sound didn't come again. The next morning, as I left for work, I saw someone lingering across the street. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, their face obscured by a hood. When I returned home that evening, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched had settled deep into my chest. By the third night, I was on edge. Every creak of the house, every shadow cast by the streetlight outside felt ominous. I checked the locks twice before bed and kept my phone close by. My mind kept circling back to the papers in the garage. Could they have something to do with this? The thought seemed absurd, but I couldn't shake it. The disturbances escalated quickly. I woke one morning to find a strange symbol drawn on my front door in what looked like chalk. It was crude and geometric, but its meaning was lost on me. That same night, I heard faint whispers outside my window, low, indistinct voices that seemed to fade the moment I strained to hear them. The figures watching my house became more frequent. Sometimes there were 2 or 3, standing silently at a distance. My yard, once neat, began to look like a battlefield. Chairs overturned, the fence gate left wide open, and footprints pressed into the dirt near my garage. I tried to convince myself that it was a coincidence, that maybe it was teenagers playing a prank or some nosy neighbors. But deep down, I knew that something about those papers had drawn unwanted attention to me. I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home, watching and waiting for the next intrusion. The breaking point came late one night when I saw someone standing directly outside my garage. Their silhouette was clear against the glow of the streetlight, motionless and unyielding. I didn't dare go outside. Instead, I stayed in bed, clutching my phone and hoping they wouldn't try to come closer. The knock on my door came 2 nights later, just as I was convincing myself that the disturbances were starting to fade. It wasn't a casual knock. It was firm, deliberate, and insistent. My heart sank instantly. Whoever was on the other side of the door wasn't here by chance. I moved toward the door slowly, my every step weighed down by dread. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man standing on my porch. His face was blank and calm, yet there was something unnerving about his presence. He wasn't dressed in anything remarkable, just a plain jacket and dark jeans, but his eyes, unblinking and fixed on the door, seemed to burn with purpose. I hesitated, but opened the door a crack, keeping the chain latched. "Can I help you?" I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've come for the papers," he said. His tone was flat, devoid of emotion, but it carried an authority that left no room for argument. "The papers?" I repeated, trying to feign ignorance, but he didn't respond. He simply stood there, staring at me, waiting. It was then that I noticed his hands. Though they were empty, they were tense, as if prepared to reach for something. A quiet, terrible realization crept over me. This man would do whatever was necessary to get what he wanted. I don't know how long I stood there, weighing my options, but it felt like hours. The man didn't move, didn't speak again, but his presence was oppressive, suffocating. I knew there was no way to talk my way out of this. "Wait here," I said finally, closing the door before he could respond. I locked it behind me and hurried to the garage, my hands trembling as I gathered the papers. As I lifted the stack, I felt the strange weight of them again. Not physical, but psychological, as though I were holding something that shouldn't exist. Returning to the door, I opened it just wide enough to pass the papers through. The man took them without a word, his eyes briefly scanning the top of the pile. His expression didn't change, but I could feel his satisfaction in the way he lingered for a moment before turning to leave. He walked away without so much as a glance back, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty street, feeling as though the air around me had finally been released from a terrible tension. The house felt different after the man left. For the first time in weeks, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. The disturbances ceased completely. No more overturned furniture, no whispers, no figures lingering outside. It was as though the storm had passed, but I couldn't shake the sense of having narrowly escaped something far worse. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I had handed over a stack of strange papers to a man I didn't know? That I'd been watched and harassed for weeks, but had no evidence to show for it? It all felt absurd, like the plot of a bad thriller novel. I tried to move on, but the experience had left its mark. I found myself double-checking the locks on my doors and windows every night. I avoided the garage entirely, unwilling to set foot in the space where those papers had lingered. What haunted me most was the question I couldn't answer. What were those papers, and why were they so important? The mystery gnawed at me, but I knew I would never find out, and maybe that was for the best. It started on a Monday, like most changes in the office do. I arrived at my desk to find a new face sitting at the previously vacant cubicle nearby. They were neatly dressed, wearing a smile that was just the right amount of friendly, not too forced, not too casual. As I walked past, they turned to greet me. "Hi, I'm Ryan," they said, extending a hand. I introduced myself and welcomed them to the team, feeling an automatic obligation to be polite. They seemed genuinely interested in my role, asking a few basic questions about the office culture and the day-to-day routines. At first glance, Ryan seemed eager to fit in, but nothing about our interaction stood out as unusual. Over the next few days, Ryan continued to engage with me during breaks or while passing in the hall. Their questions, while friendly, seemed just a bit more personal than I was used to in casual office conversations. They asked if I lived nearby, what kind of commute I had, and whether I spent much time alone outside of work. At the time, I chalked it up to an overly curious personality and gave vague answers. Ryan seemed harmless. Overly friendly, maybe, but harmless. I didn't think much of it then. The questions didn't stop. If anything, they became more probing as the days went on. Ryan wanted to know specifics, what I usually did on weekends, whether I lived with anyone, and even where I typically shopped for groceries. Their tone was always light, as if they were just making small talk, but something about the way they listened made me uneasy. One morning, as I was pouring coffee in the break room, Ryan appeared out of nowhere. They stood close, too close, and asked what brand of toothpaste I used. It was such an absurdly specific and personal question that I laughed awkwardly, assuming it was a joke. But Ryan didn't laugh. They just stared at me, waiting for an answer. I brushed it off and excused myself, but the incident lingered in my mind throughout the day. Later, I noticed Ryan watching me from across the office. They didn't seem to be working, just sitting at their desk, their eyes fixed in my direction. By the end of the week, I started taking longer routes around the office to avoid them. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe Ryan was just socially awkward, but the unease was becoming harder to ignore. The first note appeared on a Tuesday morning. It was a small slip of paper folded neatly and left on my desk. Inside, in tiny meticulous handwriting, were the words, "I see what you're hiding." I stared at the note for what felt like an eternity, my pulse quickening. Hiding what? From who? I scanned the office, but no one seemed to be paying attention. Ryan wasn't even at their desk. I stuffed the note into my pocket and tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. The next day, there was another note. This one was more cryptic. "Don't let it catch up to you." Alongside it was a small object, a single shoelace, frayed at one end. By now, I couldn't pretend this was anything but deliberate. I considered confronting Ryan, but stopped myself. What would I even say? There was no proof they were responsible, and I wasn't ready to start making accusations. The following morning, I found a scratched-out nameplate on my desk, the kind we used for office cubicles. My name was written on it in blocky, uneven letters, but someone had carved jagged lines through it, obliterating the text. My unease turned into full-blown paranoia. Every time I saw Ryan, they seemed to smile a little too long or lingered just a bit too close. I began locking my office drawer at the end of each day and taking my belongings home, unwilling to leave anything personal behind. By now, I couldn't ignore the nagging questions in my mind. Who was Ryan, and why were they targeting me? I started asking around, trying to gather information without raising suspicion. To my surprise, no one seemed to know much about Ryan. They had been introduced as a new hire, but no one could recall where they had worked before or even what department they were assigned to. I checked the company directory, but Ryan's name wasn't listed. It was as if they didn't officially exist within the organization. I tried searching for them online, hoping to find a LinkedIn profile or some trace of their background, but there was nothing. No social media, no work history, no digital footprint of any kind. Meanwhile, their behavior only grew more unnerving. During a team meeting, I caught them staring at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. When our eyes met, they didn't look away. I felt trapped, unable to focus on anything but the weight of their gaze. That night, I stayed late at the office, hoping to avoid them. But as I walked to the parking lot, I had the distinct feeling of being followed. The sensation didn't leave me until I locked myself inside my car and drove away, glancing at the rearview mirror the entire way home. By the following week, my nerves were frayed. Every time I walked into the office, I braced myself for what I might find. On Monday morning, it was the worst discovery yet. Sitting on my desk was a single key, one that looked disturbingly familiar. I held it up, examining it under the harsh fluorescent lights, and my stomach dropped. It was a perfect match for the lock on my apartment door. I stared at the key, my thoughts racing. How had they gotten it? What did it mean? Was this a warning or a promise? My breath felt shallow as I scanned the office. Ryan wasn't at their desk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were nearby, watching me. Something snapped inside me. I couldn't keep brushing this off as harmless or quirky behavior. This was deliberate, targeted, malicious. I decided then and there that I needed to confront Ryan, no matter the consequences. When I approached their cubicle, however, it was empty. The desk was spotless, devoid of any personal items or signs of use. It was as though Ryan had never been there at all. I asked a nearby colleague if they had seen Ryan that morning, but they shrugged and mumbled something about not paying attention. Feeling trapped and unnerved, I made up my mind to leave early. I needed to get away from the office, from this oppressive atmosphere. As I packed up my belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floor, every passing shadow made me jump. When I finally gathered my things and headed toward the exit, I noticed something strange. Ryan's cubicle wasn't just empty, it had been completely cleared out. The chair was pushed neatly under the desk, and the drawers were all open and empty. I walked over, my heart pounding. There were no papers, no pens, not even a stray sticky note. It was as though Ryan had never worked there at all. A wave of confusion and dread swept over me. How could someone vanish so completely in the middle of the workday? I went straight to HR, hoping to get some answers. When I asked about Ryan, the woman at the desk frowned and typed something into her computer. After a moment, she looked up at me with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry," she said. "There's no one by that name in our system. Are you sure you've got the right person?" Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I stammered out a weak reply, trying to explain that Ryan had been working just a few desks away from me for weeks. She offered to check again, but I could tell by the look on her face that it was a dead end. I left the office in a daze, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who was Ryan? Had they really been an employee, or had I imagined it all? The key to my apartment burned in my pocket, a chilling reminder that this was far from over. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long. Every creak in my apartment sounded deliberate. I kept the key on my nightstand, checking my locks obsessively each night before bed. At work, the unease only grew. Even though Ryan was gone, strange things continued to happen. My desk chair would be slightly out of place when I arrived in the morning, and I'd find papers shuffled around on my desk. Once, I came back from lunch to find my monitor tilted at an odd angle, though no one claimed to have touched it. I tried asking colleagues if they remembered Ryan, but their responses only deepened the mystery. Some vaguely recalled seeing someone sitting in the cubicle near mine, but couldn't remember their name or appearance. Others insisted that no one had been hired recently. The final straw came when I found a small note slipped into my bag. It was written in the same meticulous handwriting as the earlier notes and read simply, "You didn't listen." It was supposed to be a simple escape, a day to disconnect from the noise of daily life. The forest seemed perfect, sprawling and quiet, with only the faintest whisper of wind through the treetops. The trailhead was marked by a weathered sign bearing the forest's name, a few hiking rules, and a map that seemed straightforward enough. I stepped onto the path, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. The trail was wide and well maintained at first, winding gently between towering trees. After about an hour of walking, I came across something unusual, a bright yellow ribbon tied around a tree branch. It wasn't part of the official trail markers, which were painted symbols on rocks or wooden posts. Curious, I noticed another ribbon tied further down a smaller, less obvious path, branching off the main trail. I hesitated, but decided to follow it. The ribbons were spaced just close enough to keep sight of the next one, guiding me deeper into the forest. The new path felt untouched, quieter than the main trail, and for a while I enjoyed the solitude. The ribbons seemed thoughtful, as if someone had taken care to lead hikers through a hidden part of the woods. I wasn't worried yet. About an hour into the unmarked trail, the landscape began to change. The ground became uneven, littered with roots and stones that made walking more difficult. The ribbons, now joined by painted symbols on trees, led in odd directions, sometimes doubling back slightly before veering sharply to the left or right. At first, I chalked it up to poor planning by whoever had marked the trail. Maybe they hadn't been experienced or had intended the path for casual exploration. But as the trail narrowed further, the trees pressed closer together, and the air seemed to thicken. Something felt off. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. I paused to look around, realizing that I could no longer see the main trail in the distance. The markers had led me far deeper than I'd realized. Despite the unease creeping up my spine, I convinced myself to keep going. After all, the markers had to lead somewhere, maybe back to the main trail eventually. That's what I told myself, at least. It wasn't long before I noticed the markers behaving strangely. The ribbons and symbols began pointing in conflicting directions. One ribbon would lead down a path to the left, only for the next marker to direct me sharply to the right. I stopped in my tracks, staring at a tree with two symbols painted side by side, one pointing straight ahead, the other back toward where I had just come from. It made no sense. The sinking realization hit me. These markers weren't guiding me. They were misleading me. I retraced my steps, hoping to find a clearer path, but even that proved difficult. I began to notice faint scratches on the bark of certain trees, as though someone or something had deliberately marked them to create confusion. Some of the ribbons looked hastily tied, the knots loose and fraying. A cold sensation settled in my chest. This wasn't an accident or poor trail maintenance. Someone had deliberately set this up to confuse anyone who followed the trail. The first sound came as I was trying to orient myself. A sharp crack echoed through the trees, like a branch snapping underfoot. I spun around, scanning the dense forest, but saw nothing. My heart began to race as I strained to hear past the suffocating silence. Then came the whispers, faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from all directions at once. They weren't close, but they weren't far. I turned in slow circles, my eyes darting between the trees, but the shadows played tricks on my vision. I moved quickly, following what I thought was the way back, but the markers seemed to mock me. Ribbons appeared in places I was sure I had already passed, and the symbols grew increasingly erratic, some barely visible, others crudely scrawled as if in haste. And then the stones began. Small, flat rocks came sailing through the air, landing with unsettling precision just a few feet away from me. The first one startled me, but by the third I knew it wasn't random. Someone or something was throwing them, their intention clear. I called out, my voice shaky but firm, demanding to know who was there. The forest responded with silence. My legs felt heavy, my breath shallow as I pushed forward, no longer following the markers. I didn't care where they led, I just wanted to get out. But the deeper I moved into the woods, the more the trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. Nightfall was approaching, and with it, the oppressive feeling that I wasn't alone. Nightfall in the forest was sudden, as if someone had extinguished the light with a switch. The last slivers of sunlight slipped behind the trees, and the dense canopy above swallowed the remaining glow. My phone's flashlight provided a weak, flickering beam that only illuminated the nearest trunks and the uneven ground ahead. Every step was labored, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. My breathing seemed unnaturally loud, and my footsteps cracked twigs and rustled leaves no matter how carefully I tried to move. The markers were now irrelevant. I couldn't trust them anymore. Instead, I searched for natural signs, desperately trying to orient myself. The slope of the land, the thickness of the underbrush, anything that felt familiar. The noises in the forest grew bolder as the darkness thickened. Twigs snapped somewhere to my right, the sound deliberate, measured. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, but still too distant to make out words. My skin prickled as I caught fleeting glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows darting between trees, low to the ground and impossibly fast. Then came the breathing. At first, I thought it was my own, but as I froze in place, I realized it wasn't. The sound was faint but rhythmic, like someone exhaling just beyond the reach of my light. It was close, too close. My heart pounded as I spun in a slow circle, aiming the beam of light in every direction, but I saw nothing. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't risk blindly plunging deeper into the woods. Instead, I forced myself to keep moving steadily, following what I hoped was the direction of the main trail. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing in the path behind me. Hours felt like days as I trudged through the dark. My flashlight was growing dimmer, its once steady beam flickering ominously. My legs ached, and my chest tightened with exhaustion and fear. It was then that I stumbled upon something familiar, a tree with an odd, crooked branch that I was certain I'd passed earlier in the day. Relief surged through me for a brief moment before being replaced by dread. The realization hit me like a punch. I'd been led in circles. A low, guttural sound broke the silence, coming from somewhere behind me. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too unnatural. My body tensed as I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam of light swept across the trees, revealing nothing but the shifting shadows. I had to make a choice. I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly, trusting the markers or hoping to stumble onto the main trail. Taking a deep breath, I tried to calm my racing mind and focus on natural signs, declining terrain that might lead to lower ground or the distant sound of running water. Abandoning the markers entirely, I pushed forward, clawing my way through dense underbrush and uneven ground. My pulse pounded in my ears as the whispers grew louder, overlapping with the faint sound of footsteps that seemed to follow mine in perfect rhythm. At long last, I heard something that cut through the oppressive silence, the faint crunch of gravel underfoot. My heart leapt as I realized it was the main trail. Somewhere ahead, the trees thinned, and the faint glow of the moon broke through the canopy, illuminating a familiar path. I didn't hesitate. I broke into a stumbling run, ignoring the branches that clawed at my clothes and the roots that threatened to trip me. The whispers and footsteps followed, growing more frantic, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst onto the main trail, it was as if a weight had been lifted from my chest. The oppressive feeling of being watched ebbed slightly, though my legs still trembled and my breaths came in shallow gasps. I glanced behind me one last time, aiming my flashlight toward the trees I had just escaped. Nothing moved, but the shadows between the trunks seemed impossibly deep, as though they were watching, waiting. I arrived at the Airbnb late in the afternoon, tired from a long drive, but relieved to see the house in person. It was charming in an old-fashioned way. 2 stories, white clapboard siding, and a wraparound porch with a few worn chairs. The listing had promised peace, quiet, and a picturesque view of the woods that stretched behind the property. Stepping inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish. The furniture was simple, slightly outdated, but comfortable. A few creaks in the floorboards gave the place character, and I felt the tension from my trip begin to fade. The host had left a welcome note on the kitchen counter with a small basket of snacks, a nice touch that made the house feel inviting. As I explored, I noticed a door at the end of the hallway upstairs that was locked. It wasn't mentioned in the listing, and there was no note or explanation about it. I assumed it was a storage closet or a space the host used for personal belongings, something common in vacation rentals. I didn't think much of it as I unpacked my things, settling into the cozy bedroom on the opposite end of the hall. The evening passed uneventfully. After a simple dinner and some reading, I turned in for the night, looking forward to a few days of uninterrupted rest. The first sign of trouble came the next morning. As I prepared breakfast, I noticed that a bottle of water I'd placed on the counter the night before was gone. I checked the fridge and the trash, thinking I'd misplaced it, but it was nowhere to be found. It was a small thing, easily dismissed, so I brushed it off. Maybe I'd finished it and forgotten. That night, however, as I lay in bed, I heard faint noises. At first, I thought it was the house settling, wood groaning and creaking in the way old houses often do. But the sounds became more distinct, a muffled thud, followed by what sounded like faint footsteps. They seemed to come from the locked room. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe an animal on the roof. Pulling the blanket tighter, I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, another bottle of water was missing, along with an apple I had left on the kitchen counter. This time, I was certain I hadn't touched them. I checked the trash again, my unease growing, but found nothing. I glanced toward the locked door at the end of the hall. Something about it unsettled me now, though I couldn't explain why. The air around it felt heavier, colder. The third night, I couldn't ignore the sounds any longer. They began softly again, faint shuffling and the occasional creak. But as the hours passed, they grew louder and more deliberate. Footsteps, unmistakable this time, paced back and forth behind the locked door. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Gripping my phone, I debated calling the host to ask about the room, but it was late, and I wasn't sure how to explain without sounding paranoid. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, replaced by silence so deep it felt suffocating. I waited, straining to hear any sign of movement, but none came. Minutes ticked by, and I began to question if I'd imagined the whole thing. As I tried to relax, I thought I heard something even more unsettling, a faint cough, as if someone was standing just behind the locked door. I didn't sleep that night, the feeling of being watched pressing down on me like a physical weight. The next day passed uneventfully, though my nerves were frayed. I kept glancing at the locked door, half expecting it to open on its own. That evening, as I climbed the stairs to bed, I froze. The door was slightly ajar, the lock that had been so secure now hanging loose. A sliver of darkness spilled out into the hallway, as if inviting me to come closer. My heart raced as I approached slowly, my hand outstretched to push it open further. Before I could touch the door, it slammed shut with a force that made the floorboards shudder. I stumbled back, fear gripping me. There was no breeze, no logical explanation for what had just happened. The lock clicked audibly, securing the door once again. I stared at the door, half expecting it to open again, but it remained still. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I convinced myself to wait until morning. That night, I slept with the lights on, though sleep was more of a series of brief, restless dozes. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. The next morning, I woke with a pounding headache, the result of a restless night filled with half-heard sounds and persistent paranoia. I couldn't shake the events of the previous evening. The way the door had slammed shut on its own played over and over in my mind, accompanied by the faint cough I'd heard the night before. Determined to find answers, I started looking for signs that someone else was in the house. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, ensuring they were secure. Nothing seemed out of place. The front door deadbolt was intact, and there was no sign of forced entry anywhere. Then I turned my attention to the locked door upstairs. I examined the frame, searching for scratches or signs that it had been tampered with, but everything appeared undisturbed. I tried the handle again, just to be sure, and found it locked tightly. As I searched through the rest of the house, I found something unexpected in one of the kitchen drawers, a small leather-bound journal. The edges were worn, and the pages inside were yellowed and filled with messy handwriting. Flipping through, I realized it belonged to a previous guest. The entries were fragmented, but a few sentences stood out. Strange noises from the locked room again last night. It feels like someone is in there. I woke up to find the door open, but when I got close, it slammed shut. I think I should leave soon. I told the host about the room, but they just brushed it off. Something isn't right here. I put the journal down, my hands trembling. This wasn't just in my head. Others had experienced the same things. That night, I decided I couldn't stay another day. The house no longer felt like a place of refuge, but a trap waiting to spring. I packed my bag and prepared to leave first thing in the morning, but as darkness fell, the house seemed to come alive. The noises started earlier this time, soft creaks and shuffles echoing from the locked room. I sat frozen on the couch, my ears straining to catch every sound. Then, around midnight, the footsteps began. They weren't hurried but deliberate, pacing back and forth behind the locked door. My breathing grew shallow as I realized they weren't just random. They were methodical, almost as if whoever, or whatever, was inside was waiting for me to react. Gathering every ounce of courage, I approached the door one final time. My fingers hovered over the handle, debating whether to try and open it. Before I could act, a low, guttural sound emanated from behind the door, a noise so unnatural it sent a chill down my spine. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and fled to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The noises continued for hours, scratching, thuds, and faint whispers, but I forced myself to stay put, clutching my phone in one hand and a flashlight in the other. At the first hint of dawn, I grabbed my bag and bolted downstairs, my nerves raw and frayed. I didn't bother cleaning up or leaving a note for the host. I just wanted to get out of that house as fast as possible. As I approached the door, I hesitated, glancing back toward the staircase. The house was eerily silent now, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. For a moment, I half expected to see the door upstairs swing open, revealing whatever had been lurking behind it. I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air, and hurried to my car. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, and it wasn't until I'd locked the doors and started the engine that I felt a shred of relief. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and empty, but just as I rounded the bend that took it out of sight, I thought I saw movement in one of the upstairs windows. Back home, I debated contacting the host to tell them what had happened. But what would I even say? That their Airbnb was haunted? That someone or something was living in the locked room? When I finally worked up the courage to check the listing again, it was gone. The house wasn't listed anymore, and the host's profile had been removed. A chill ran through me as I realized I might never get an explanation for what had happened. It started as an ordinary morning. My walk to the office was uneventful until I noticed a small, flat object lying on the ground near my car. At first glance, it looked like a hotel keycard, the kind with a magnetic strip. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was unmarked, except for a faint symbol etched into the corner, an abstract shape that didn't mean anything to me. Curious, I slid it into my pocket and forgot about it until later that day when I emptied my bag and found a folded piece of paper tucked inside. My stomach tightened as I realized I hadn't put it there. The paper contained a set of cryptic instructions. Access, keycard required. Location, 1549 Watson Ave. Time, 11:45 p.m. tonight. My first instinct was to throw the card and paper away. This felt too strange, like a prank or a mistake meant for someone else. But something about the precise directions and the eerily nondescript address gnawed at my curiosity. By the time night fell, I'd convinced myself to check it out. It was probably nothing, a warehouse, maybe, or an abandoned building. But part of me needed to know. The address led me to an industrial part of town I'd never been to before. The area was eerily quiet, the streets lined with darkened warehouses and office buildings that looked like they hadn't been used in years. 1549 Watson Ave was a squat, gray structure with no signage or windows, its walls smooth and featureless. A single light above the door cast a weak glow, illuminating a card reader mounted next to the entrance. I hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. The street was empty. The stillness was unnerving, broken only by the occasional hum of distant traffic. I pulled the keycard from my pocket, suddenly aware of how cold it felt against my skin. Sliding it through the reader, I half expected nothing to happen. But the lock clicked and the door swung open. Inside, a narrow hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that made my nose wrinkle. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a soft hiss. The hallway seemed to go on forever, flanked by doors that were either locked or sealed shut. The walls were bare, their pale gray paint peeling in places, revealing patches of discolored plaster beneath. As I walked, the faint sound of machinery hummed in the background, an uneven, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from deep within the building. Occasionally, I thought I heard other noises, faint whispers, the shuffle of footsteps, or the creak of something heavy shifting in the distance. I tried to ignore the growing unease in my chest, telling myself it was just my imagination. But every step seemed to amplify the oppressive silence around me, and the hallway felt colder the further I went. At one point, I stopped to inspect one of the doors. It was metal, with no handle or visible lock. Leaning closer, I noticed scratches near the edges, as though someone had tried to force it open. I stepped back quickly, the hair on my arms standing on end. Pushing forward, I followed the hallway as it curved sharply to the right, revealing another corridor. This one was lined with overhead lights, half of which were either flickering or completely out. A faint noise, a soft, almost melodic hum, drifted from somewhere ahead, and I hesitated. I wasn't alone. As I ventured deeper into the building, I began noticing signs of its former use. Scattered papers littered the floor, some blank, others filled with dense text in languages I didn't recognize. An overturned chair lay against the wall, its legs bent at odd angles, as if someone had thrown it in a fit of rage. The humming noise grew louder, more mechanical, and I followed it to a large room at the end of the corridor. Inside, faint blue light emanated from a console in the corner, illuminating a space filled with old, dust-covered equipment. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, as though someone had just been there. I approached the console, my footsteps echoing loudly against the concrete floor. The screen flickered, displaying static interspersed with flashes of distorted text. I leaned closer, trying to read it, but the words were garbled and nonsensical. A loud clang from somewhere behind me made me jump. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was as still as before. The door, which I had left ajar, was now slightly closed, as though nudged by an unseen hand. The sense of unease that had been building since I entered the building now flared into full-blown panic. I backed away from the console, trying to retrace my steps. The hallway outside seemed darker than I remembered, and as I moved, the faint whispering I'd heard earlier returned, louder this time, as if coming from all directions. Something wasn't right. I wasn't alone here. As I moved back down the hallway, my footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, the echoes bouncing off the concrete walls. The whispering continued, faint but insistent, growing clearer with each step I took. It no longer sounded like a trick of the air. It was deliberate, layered, and disturbingly human. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone, but the hallway remained empty. The overhead lights flickered erratically, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dart and twist at the edges of my vision. My heart pounded as I forced myself to keep walking, every instinct screaming at me to run. Ahead, the hallway opened into another room, larger than the last. The floor was littered with broken furniture, torn fabric, and shards of glass that crunched under my shoes. In the center of the room stood a table with a single object resting on it, a second keycard. I approached cautiously, my breath shallow. The keycard was identical to the one I'd found earlier, save for a different symbol etched into its corner. Next to it was a folded piece of paper, its edges stained and frayed. Unfolding it, I read the hastily scrawled message, "Do not trust the exit." My blood ran cold. The message made no sense, or maybe it made too much sense. The noises behind me grew louder, more distinct, the scrape of something dragging across the floor, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. Grabbing the keycard, I bolted out of the room without looking back. The layout of the building had changed. Hallways that I had walked down earlier were now unfamiliar, twisting in directions that made no logical sense. Doors I had passed before were now sealed shut, their edges warped as if the building itself was closing in around me. The whispers morphed into low murmurs, then guttural growls, and finally silence, a silence so profound that every breath I took felt deafening. The oppressive weight of the atmosphere bore down on me, making every step feel like I was walking through water. I reached a door marked with the same symbol as the new key card. My hands trembled as I swiped it through the reader. The door clicked open, revealing a stairwell that descended into darkness. Descending felt like a mistake, but the building left me no choice. The moment I stepped into the stairwell, the door slammed shut behind me, sealing with a metallic clang. The walls of the stairwell were damp, the air thick with a musty odor that made it hard to breathe. As I moved downward, the faint hum of machinery returned, now accompanied by a distant, rhythmic pounding that seemed to resonate from somewhere far below. At the bottom of the stairs, I found another hallway, its walls covered in strange, overlapping symbols. My head throbbed as I stared at them, their patterns almost hypnotic. Whatever they meant, they didn't feel welcoming. The pounding noise grew louder as I stumbled through the hallway, disoriented and desperate to find a way out. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the gloom. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the periphery of my vision, dark shapes darting just out of sight. I came across a heavy metal door marked with yet another symbol, this one resembling an exit sign but distorted, its angles jagged and wrong. Above the door was a keypad, its screen glowing faintly. I hesitated, the earlier warning, "Do not trust the exit," echoing in my mind. The noises behind me were closing in, whispers that seemed to mock, footsteps that quickened with purpose, and the distinct sound of something dragging across the floor. I entered the code etched into the keycard, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor lit by faint red lights. The oppressive air grew heavier as I ran through it, the whispers now deafening and incoherent. At the end of the corridor was another door, this one ajar. I pushed through it, emerging into the cool night air. The contrast was so sudden it made me dizzy. The building loomed behind me, its gray walls darkened in the moonlight. I stumbled to my car, fumbling with the keys and locking the doors as soon as I climbed inside. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The building was still there, its edges blurred by the distance, but in one of the upper windows, I thought I saw a faint light flicker before it went dark.